I just want to say a few words, share a few thoughts on this situation in Ecuador, because it's escalating, and I think that country is at a precipice in terms of will it be another Latin American country plagued by gang violence, drug violence, or will it be a turning point where this situation can be contained? Enormous pressure on President Daniel Noboa. He's only 36. He's one of the youngest leaders in the world. I'm 38. So I'm thinking this is a guy who's in charge of a country and is 2 years younger than me. It's a huge amount of responsibility. So the situation's obviously escalated in recent weeks. A lot of commentators have pointed out that Ecuador is different from other parts of Latin America in that traditionally it's been comparatively peaceful. It hasn't had the problems, for example, of Peru or Colombia. I mean, in the 80s, they were a byword for, cocaine, drug lords, and so on. And in more recent years, Mexico has been in the 2010s. But it looks like Ecuador is in a serious situation here. Um, There was, of course, attention on the country last year when the presidential candidate Antonio Villavicencio um, was assassinated. By the way, just apologies if my pronunciation of names isn't wonderful. Um, but I think that, I mean, honestly, I don't have a magic wand here of what the right approach should be. I do think that the president has to show a resolute approach to this. I think there's some obvious problems that have been lingering for a long time. The the penal system there is badly organised, and Guayaquil, major port city, it's kind of become I don't want to say safe haven, but it's kind of now been targeted by the cartels. It's been seen as an easy route. And unlike people trafficking, which tends to be land routes, like people trafficking into the southern border, drug trafficking, apparently this is mostly for a European market, is by maritime routes. Um, Let me just say for the record, I hate drugs. I hate the problems that they cause in this world. Not just the obvious health problems, but the fact that they're so complicit in violence in Latin America. I mean, the demand for drugs. There are those who say just legalize all drugs and this problem will go away. I'm not convinced. Um, the few case studies or the few examples where there has been a universal legalization are really, really not enough to go on as a sort of blueprint of, oh, we'll just legalize all drugs and then it'll drive gangs underground. Um, what we often hear is a war on drugs has failed. Well, that may be true, but um, I think, and I know this will be a controversial thing to say, but I do believe that a cocaine user in Frankfurt or Paris or London has responsibility. They're choosing to take an illegal Class A substance, and this is the result. You know, it empowers these gangs. Um, Now, there may be an argument that legalizing it will take away for power from gangs, but I don't think there's hard evidence that that would definitely be the case. And I think that my issue with that is it normalizes drugs, um, which are lethal substances. But basically, the cartels, you know, they, they are as ruthless and as sadistic and as cruel as any Islamist terror group. Um, President Noboa has basically called them domestic terrorists, and I think there's no other word for them. Now, in all likelihood, he will copy the approach of, I forget his name off the top of my head, the Salvadorian president, which is basically a completely ruthless approach of mass incarceration. Now, that has actually been very popular in El Salvador. El Salvador has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, but violent crime there has reduced in recent years as a result of this policy. It's controversial because it takes away due process and basically gang members have just been mass incarcerated. Um, that in American prisons are like human battery farms. They're incredibly cramped. The conditions are awful. But I also think that as a European, it's easy to sit here and say, "Oh well, there's human rights issues going on there." But there's also human rights of victims of crime. There's human rights of those journalists, TV presenters who were held up at gunpoint. Um, I think that was in Quito. So in this sort of situation, you can't apply the situation in the UK or the Netherlands to what's going on in Ecuador. I think the only choice is a ruthless one. And I think it would get public support from the Ecuadorian people. I mean, the sad reality is there may be innocent people caught up. And this is another. See, this there's other examples of this in the Philippines. President Duterte's controversial drug war that's been continued by President Marcos. Unquestionably, there will have been innocent people caught up. No doubt there will be corrupt police who will plant weapons on people and say there were drug traffickers or gangsters. I've just seen footage of a young man being frisked, and I think he had a gang tattoo. But the soldiers, they had these balaclavas. I guess it's deliberately meant to conceal their identity, but sort of skulls. It's quite scary looking actually. But um, the problem is there needs to be a message sent out to the challenge is there needs to be a message sent out to these cartels that the government will take a robust response. I think they've been complacent. And I think that's why this has escalated, because they felt empowered, they felt complacent, or rather the government's maybe being complacent. So, you know, if it's a choice between maybe some of those accused won't have full due process versus a situation that gets out of control, and Ecuador resembles Honduras or El Salvador before, the crackdown, then, or maybe a better comparison would be Honduras or Venezuela, then honestly, I don't think there's much choice. Um, I mean, I do think of the nuances of this. Let's say, for example, you have a poor young man, and this is not me being some sort of bleeding heart liberal, but I'm just considering different nuances. You have a poor young man who is basically living in a poor neighborhood, and he's coerced by the cartels to join. And if he refuses to join, he's murdered. So he joins, then he's got caught up in this, and then he'll be, thrown in prison with the rest of them. It's a horrendous choice that young men in that part of the world have to make. On the other hand, the drug kingpins, like this guy Adolfo, I forget his nickname now, but I mean, they are the scum of the earth as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they should be treated as terrorists. So I think there should be a crackdown, but the focus should be on the kingpins rather than the low level. Because the thing is, you could get into a situation where the army or the police, no doubt some of them have been corrupted themselves, but you could get into a situation where they're taking out low level gang members. But I think the big focus has to be on the kingpins. Bring them down, jail them, kill them if necessary, if it comes to that. It may well have to be that there has to be a very robust response that scares the cartels. And these are ruthless, dangerous people. And I think the problem is they're not scared. I think there needs to be a situation where they are frankly terrorized themselves. I believe in human rights, but I also believe that you can't just have a one size fits all in the sense of what works in Europe will work there. This is an emergency situation. And in an emergency situation, there has to be drastic measures. So I would say, at least for a short time, it has to be ruthless, arrest all gang members. Those who resist will be shot. I mean, that is, unfortunately, I think it's come to that, because what is the alternative? The alternative is that country goes down into the abyss and it becomes as violent as Honduras or Venezuela. So I think there's no choice. But then, when the situation is contained, then perhaps look at, give due process to low level gang members. But, someone like the Adolfo, a character like that, I really think they are, you cannot You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot give them any ground, because as soon as you do, all these people care about is power. And I think as soon as criminals, get that mentality, they will never stop. So I think, of course, people will say, "Oh, but you're just tackling the surface issue." Of course, there's underlying issues. There's a chaotic justice system. There is corruption. There's probably poverty that gets these cartel members to join in the first place. There's all those issues, but this is an emergency. And right now, I think President Noboa has no choice but to just take a hardline approach. But of course, I'm not there. I'd like to hear from Ecuadorians about this situation. Do you support your president? Do you think this is the right approach? What do you think of the situation that young men face today? Are they joining these cartels for money? Are they coerced into doing so? Because if they are, I sympathise with them there. I've no sympathy for people who terrorise civilians or hold guns to journalists, but yeah, that's my take as an outsider, and I emphasise as an outsider. But I think, unfortunately, there's no other choice but to take a hardline approach. Let me know your thoughts.